Want to do the big finale of the Chinese New Year 2022? But here's yours.
So why was the dragon behind the rat, ox, tiger, and rabbit in the Chinese zodiac race?
I bet he was generous to those four.
Maybe the rat bit the dragon, the ox bumped the dragon, the tiger scratched the dragon, and the rabbit stomped on the dragon. Or maybe the rat, ox, tiger, and rabbit had jetpacks and whizzed past the dragon. Those are interesting theories, but the reason why the dragon is in 5th place is because... Looks like Chinese New Year's over. I'll tell you more about it next year.
Today, we're taking off for the Geography of China. So that's gotta be the big finale of the Chinese New Year 2022. So, let's take a look and find out. Seems a little bit lucky days though, but I'm on it.
Greetings, students, and welcome to this edition of Mr. Zoller's Social Studies Podcast. On today's edition, we're going to be talking a little bit about the geography of China.
And I want to introduce yourself. My name is Yona, and this is Pom Pom from Disney Cinderella 2.
Well, look at this map and identify the location of China.
And me, Sagwa Miao.
Now, let me pause for a second, because when we go through these podcasts, I want to give you a pointer here on how that you can use them best. If you want to take any of this information and write it down in your notes, all you need to do is pause the podcast, record the information.
Wow, very good education of that, Sagwa. But I'm on it.
And then, when you're ready, simply unpause the video and we'll go on. Let's try that right now. Go ahead and pause the video. And we're back. All right. Now that we've talked about the location of China, let's see if we can understand exactly why that location is so important. There are two important geographic factors that limited China's contact with outside. One example of this would be long distances. Quite simply, because of China's location in Eastern Asia,
love this
they were just simply very far away from other contemporary civilizations in the world at that time. But there's another geographic factor at work here as well, and that is natural barriers. China is surrounded by a series of imposing natural barriers.
Very good about that, Sagwa.
For people to come into or out of
Here's
China.
the fact what
Let
I
me give
said.
you some examples of what I'm talking about. The first natural barrier that I want to talk about is the Tibetan Plateau. Go ahead and write that down. Now, in order to understand why the Tibetan Plateau is such an imposing barrier, we first need to make sure that we understand exactly what a plateau is.
You know.
Do you remember your geographic terms? A plateau
Well, you remember go to school,
is a mostly level expanse of land that is at a very high elevation. Let me give you a photo of what I'm talking about. This is the city of Lhasa, which is the capital city of Tibet. But what I want you to notice here in the background is that we do have mountains. We do have some elevation within the plateau. A plateau itself is not necessarily entirely what you understand is the entire landscape itself is raised to a very high elevation.
You know,
That's
the
why
St. Patrick's
plateaus
Day,
would be
lucky
challenging
me,
natural barriers
as
to cross.
on its
Let me give
way.
you another example of a natural barrier. We also see the Himalayan Mountains forming part of the natural border of China. Now, when we're talking about the Himalayan Mountains, then you've got to remember that that is the largest mountain range in the world. Take a look at a photo here of one of these particular mountains. By the way,
Pretty
do you have an
photograph.
idea exactly what mountain we must be looking at here? That's right. That is a picture of Mount Everest. All 29,000 plus feet of Mount Everest.
And this one
So
is
that
coming out
gives you a
on January
good idea
2nd,
of exactly
2012.
How challenging it would
But
be to try to
seriously,
enter China
I'm
by
a
crossing
Chinese
over the Himalayan
Siamese cat.
Mountains. Here's another imposing
Actually.
natural barrier. The Gobi Desert forms part of the natural border of China between China and what is today Mongolia. Now, why is the Gobi Desert such an imposing natural barrier? Well, what you have to remember is, even though it's relatively flat, like we see in this picture, deserts are areas that get very little rainfall. In fact, they get less than 10 inches of rain per year. What that means is there's not going to be a lot of available sources of water, not a lot of rivers
Meow.
or streams,
Meow, meow,
not
meow,
a lot of
meow.
natural rain pools that collect. So it's going to be difficult to cross over this
Meow.
desert, certainly for a small group, but especially for a large army to try to enter China from that direction. The last natural barrier that I want to talk to you about today is a natural barrier to the east. And if you
It's an
look at the
ocean!
map, you can tell that we have the Pacific Ocean then located
Oh,
to the east.
that's the Pacific
All right, so
Ocean.
let's pause for a second and look at this from a different perspective. Specifically, what we're doing is looking down on Asia. This is a composite satellite map of Asia. So we've got China over here. Down here in the corner, that's the beginning of the peninsula of India that we see. And what I'd like to do is see, based on what we have discussed, if you can identify these various natural barriers.
Looking
here
for
in China.
information, though.
Well, let's start with our first one. Take a look at the color, first of all. That'll give you a clue. Notice we don't see the deep greens like what we see in some of the regions in eastern China. We don't see a lot of speckling or anything indicating that probably that
So
terrain is
close
relatively
to do
flat.
that.
If you guessed that this was the Gobi Desert, you would be correct. Now look down here to the southwest. What you'll see there is kind of a line, and on one side you see some more browns, on the other you see some deeper greens, but right along that ridge there you notice that we have some speckling of white. Well, that white
Like a
that we're looking at
Himalayan
is actually
Mountains, you
snow.
know?
So this natural barrier is, that's right, you guessed it, these are the Himalayan
Himalayan
Mountains. That's snow
Mountains.
on the top of those mountains that we can see even in this satellite image, which is pretty neat. Now look at this natural barrier. Here you notice that we've got a little bit more rugged landscape, some variation in the color tells us that. So this is the Tibetan Plateau. Now, of course, to the east,
It's
we
the Pacific
have
Ocean.
the Pacific Ocean. But what I'd like you to really focus on is these three natural barriers to the west. If you line those up, you'll notice that we create essentially a natural wall. And that natural wall is going to make it very difficult for people to come into China or to leave China. Now, let's stop and talk
As
about the
I'm
effects
going
of
to
that.
say.
How do you suppose this geography is going to influence the way that China develops? You probably could be able to identify that this is really a
identified their
mixed
problems,
effect.
too.
There are some ways that this geography will help China, but there are also some ways that it will hurt China. I want to see if you can identify some examples of this. So why don't you go ahead and pause the video and write down your answers to this question. Then when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll talk about what you've decided. All right, let's see what you were able to come up with. First of all, how did these natural barriers help China in their development? Probably you said something along the lines of there would be fewer invasions of China.
Fewer
If you take
wars.
the Gobi Desert, for example, it's
Yeah.
already difficult to
Yeah.
cross the Gobi Desert as it is. But can you imagine trying to march an entire army across the Gobi Desert with no sources of water? The same thing certainly would be true of the Himalayan Mountains. It's going to be
And what
very
was
difficult.
hurt?
We're going to see very
Supposed to.
few examples of armies coming in from outside China and attempting to conquer them. So that certainly is helpful to China. It's going to allow them to develop unopposed, so to speak.
Ooh,
But how do you
what
suppose
is that?
we might see some negative effects coming out of these natural barriers? Well, you probably said something along the lines of, there will
Less
be less
trade?
If it's difficult for armies to come in and out, it's going to be difficult for merchants to come in and out. But let's pause here for a second, because I want to make sure that we understand exactly what it is that we're discussing. Is it reasonable for us to say that long distances prevented all
really?
trade between
Got it
China
out
and
of
other
that
ancient
booster
civilizations?
before.
Of course not. It's not going to prevent all trade. But what we might say is it's going to make trade more difficult. We're going to see it be more difficult for merchants to bring goods in and out of China. It's going to be difficult for ideas to travel in and out of China as a result of these natural barriers. All right, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about the rivers of China. There are two rivers that I'm going to want you to know. One is called the Huanghe River, and the other is called the Yangtze River. Now, what we see
Yangtze.
happening in China is a tendency
a
by
little
these
bit
rivers
though.
to flood. And that does two different things. On the one hand, it deposits fertile soil on the land around it after it floods. But, of course, there's the destruction that's
Do you know
caused
what
by
it
the floods.
means, though?
So, what we see here is,
It's
again, a mixed effect
gotta be
from
true.
these geographic features. Does this sound
I'll tell
familiar
you
to
what.
by the way? Does this sound like any
Don't
other
even
civilization that you've studied
mentioning
before? Now,
you.
you might come up with several different examples, but probably the most famous example that we know of a river that floods, but as a result of the flood allows the civilization to exist there would be, how about
Egypt!
So let's look at another satellite image. Here's a satellite image looking down on Egypt, and you can clearly see the location of the Nile River. Because along the Nile River, we see green area. That's area that's been irrigated by the waters of the Nile River. And that farming wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the Nile River. How do I know that? Well,
Ooh.
look at the area that surrounds the Nile
this.
River. Around it, all we see is vast open desert. But near the Nile River, we see lush green farmland. We see something similar happening in China as well. Let's go back to China and talk a little bit about the Huanghe River, which has a very ominous nickname. It is sometimes called the River of Sorrows. Now, where do you suppose it's going to get a name like the River of Sorrows? Well, of course, that comes from the destructive flooding. When it floods,
flood
it
warning.
levels crops,
I see. I have
houses.
monster with 3
So
eyes
then
on
you might
that.
ask, well then why
Pretty
would
smart
people continue
geniuses.
to live near this river? Why wouldn't they live farther away from the river so that they didn't experience all these negative effects?
Meow.
Well, the reason is because by living near the river, they can take advantage of the fertile soil that's deposited. There are a lot of crops, like, for example, rice, that thrive in this sort of environment. So let's talk about that fertile soil for a second.
Okay.
There's a name for this yellow soil that blows off of areas like the Gobi Desert. It gets picked up into the waters of the river. And then when the rivers flood, and then they recede again afterwards, they leave behind this yellow soil. This is known as loess. Go ahead and write that down. Loess is that yellow soil that is brought by the floods. And this is why we see these farmers continuing to live on the banks of these rivers. Well, that's it for today's podcast.
Well, that's it. So the Chinese New Year is probably over. Well, so long.